This year I'm sharing as my sacred text for each of my messages either a hymn or reading from our hymnal, Singing the Living Tradition. And of course, this is a favorite old hymn of many of us, Amazing Grace. And I'm going to be sharing a little about that with you today. I want to start out sharing about the person that wrote the words. This is John Newton. Newton was born in London, July 24th, 1725. He was the son of a ship's commander. Now, his family was not a religious family. They believed in hard work, though, and his dad put him to work when he was just 11 years old. When he was 11, Newton went to sea with his father. In 1743, he was on his way to a position as a slave master on a plantation in Jamaica. So he stayed in Jamaica for a while, and he was going up the ladder as first maybe a foreman, and then he was going to be a slave master in Jamaica. But he was pressed into naval service by Britain. He became a midshipman, but after a demotion for trying to desert, I guess he decided it wasn't for him, he requested an exchange to a slave ship bound for West Africa. And that's how he got into the slaving business, was as an effort to, when he was demoted in the Navy, and he requested an exchange to a slave ship bound for West Africa. Now, eventually, he reached the coast of Sierra Leone, where he actually became a slave himself. They sold him to some folks there, some slave traders, and he became the servant of an abusive slave trader. He was the servant of that man's queen, the wife, so he had to do whatever the queen wanted him to do. Well, you can imagine what life was like for him. So again, he's like, can I get out of this? He gets in one kind of situation after another. Well, eventually, in 1748, he was rescued. He was rescued by a sea captain and returned to England. During a storm, though, and this is what you may have seen in the movie, during a storm when he thought the ship might sink, it was being tossed and turned, and they thought it was going to go under. Some water did get in and fill one part, but he prayed. He wasn't a religious man, but he decided, maybe it's now time to pray. He prayed for deliverance. This experience began his conversion to evangelical Christianity. But it wasn't like the movie. He didn't all of a sudden see all the light. He saw a little speck of the light that he needed to change his ways. At least he was so glad to be saved from that situation. He didn't leave the slave trade business, though, okay? That was, you know, the movie made it sound like he did, but he did not. Later, while he was aboard a slave vessel bound for the West Indies, he became ill with a violent fever. Very, very sick on this boat. And again, he asked for God's mercy. Please deliver me from this illness. He said this was an experience that was the turning point in his life. But he didn't leave the slave trading business. Okay, he rationalized that, you know. We do that sometimes. We say, I'm making a change in my life, but I'm going to hold on to this because this is how everybody makes a living. This is what we do, and, you know, I got to. So he didn't. He still held on to it, and he still was in the slave trading business. However, eventually, it was an evolution, I guess, in his life. It didn't come all at once with some sudden conversion. He gradually came to understand that what he was doing was wrong. And he came to the understanding that maybe he himself needed to go into the ministry. By then, he was ready to go, as we Southerners say, whole hog, okay? So on the 17 June 1764, he finally became a priest. He became an Anglican priest in Olney in Buckinghamshire. Now, he was well known for his wonderful pastoral care he gave. He was liked by both the Anglicans and the nonconformists. They all liked him. He gave wonderful preaching messages, and he would also like to sing. So he collaborated with William Cowper, and they produced a volume of hymns. One of the hymns in that volume was Amazing Grace. And indeed, he did think back on his times on those boats and how he was saved and how he was able to come to some kind of eventual understanding. And actually, he became an abolitionist and even wrote tracts against slavery eventually. So he did turn around from that, but it wasn't some sort of sudden after the storm conversion. Now, he wrote 6 verses that were produced in that hymnal. And it was called the Only Hymnal because that was where it was produced. He wrote 6 verses. 3 of those are in our hymnal. You may say, Jane, I remember there are 4 verses in our hymnal. That's true. But only the first 3 were written by John Newton. And Robert, if you'll come back and give us an introduction, we are going to now sing and think about these words and think about his life and story as you sing these first 3 verses that are in our hymnal of Amazing Grace. Grace will lead me home. What was the grace that John Newton was talking about? And what do we mean when we talk about grace? Well, the word grace can be traced to the Latin word gratia, meaning favor, charm, and thanks. You know, charm, doing something gracefully, like the bird going to the eye. Favor, do me a favor. And thanks. Now, my upbringing, I didn't learn that as grace. I didn't learn that as a doctrine of grace. My upbringing in the Baptist church, I learned that grace is God's unmerited gift of salvation to us, the undeserving recipients. We were told that we are sinners, and it's only by God's grace and by the blood of Jesus, etc., that we are saved. And this is what I learned as the doctrine of grace. And indeed, when I was in seminary, I had to study Augustine's, or some people say Augustine's, all his doctrine of grace, which was very much about these kinds of things. So some people, when they talk about grace, are talking about the doctrine of grace as expressed in some Christian churches and by some Christian doctrines. However, interesting enough, you know, if you go back and look in the Bible, which some of us do sometimes, you know, the 2 words that are most often translated as grace are the Hebrew word kahan and the Greek word charis. Those words are the words that are translated as grace. And both the Hebrew and Greek words give the same sense to the word grace. It has to do with favor, with beauty, graciousness, and thankfulness. It's the same meaning that we talked about before, the dictionary meaning. That is the way grace is used in the Bible. Now, when it talks about the other kind of forgiveness and salvation, it uses a word that in the Bible is most often translated as mercy. mercy. So that's the difference. But if you look at how grace is used in the Bible, it's not used in the way Augustine used it or the way that my church used it when I was growing up. So I have two amazing grace stories that I want to share with you today because, you know, most of us, what we get most out of is not necessarily a bunch of facts or dictionary definitions or something when we come to church. What we tend to remember is the stories. So I have two true stories to share with you today about amazing grace. Now, the first story is about a very dear friend of mine. His name is Chris Bowen, and he's given me permission to share this anytime, and his rediscovery of Amazing Grace. Now, Chris is seen here with his little boy, Andrew. I taught Chris when Chris was an undergraduate student. And at that time, Chris was married and had a baby, and we all would get around the baby and ooh and ah, you know. Well, Chris actually was a gay man. He tried to live a straight life for a long time, and eventually he just couldn't do it anymore. It couldn't go forward anymore. His church rejected him as he came out as a gay man, like many do sometimes, still do sometimes. So Chris struggled with that because he'd always been a religious person, but he knew he was doing the right thing to be true to himself, And Chris told me about his singing. He used to love to sing when he was in college, and he loved to sing when he was in the church growing up with his grandparents. And he said one of his favorite songs was Amazing Grace. But he said, Jane, I just can't sing it with any authenticity anymore. I just can't sing it anymore, although I love the song. And I told him, I said, Chris, you can sing that song. You just have to see it through a gay lens, through a different lens. You think about that song. You think about the fact that you were lost in trying to be somebody you were not, but you found now. You were blinded to being able to be your own self, but now you see. You have the amazing grace of being able to be yourself, to be you in this life. He said, oh yeah, I can see that now. I can see that. And we held hands and sang Amazing Grace. So that's my first story. My second story is about my dad and Amazing Grace. This is a picture of me and my dad when I retired at my retirement reception from Georgia Southern in 2005. He just lived 1 year beyond that. He died in 2006. My dad was a difficult man. He was hard to live with. I do not know how my mama did it all those years. I really don't. I just lift her up in praise. He wasn't that different from probably maybe your dad or granddad, though, you know. My dad was very biased and prejudiced. My dad was a car dealer. Well, you know about car dealers. He rationalized it was okay back when they would let you run the meter back on the used cars. Well, everybody does it, he said. And, you know, people know they're not getting the true mileage and all this stuff. And he did, you know, he was a car dealer. He did all kinds of things. My dad was full of sins. And I loved him, though, and he loved me. He never told me he loved me because, you know, the way he showed me his love because he provided for me. That's what he saw. I provide for my family. I make the money that gets them what they need. And that's how I show my love. And many men were like that at that time period, and maybe some still are. Well, my dad, though, interestingly enough, believed he was a good man. He thought of himself as a good man, even though all these things were going on. Do you know some people like that? Okay. They say, I'm a good man. I'm a good person. I'm a good man. And he thought of himself as a good man. And in fact, he said he looked forward to the day. He said, when I die, I'm going to my reward. My reward. That's how you pronounce it. I'm going to go to my reward when I die. I said, good, Daddy. Well, my daddy got Alzheimer's. And unlike most people who get Alzheimer's, some of them get a little mean when they do, my daddy got sweet. He started telling me he loved me. Now, he didn't know my name, who I was. But he said, I love you. He'd tell him about walking the door, I love you, I love you. I loved hearing that. You know, I love you, and he's loving everybody. The way I was able to connect with my dad, though, even though he didn't know who I was through the old songs. He couldn't remember anything else, but I would sit down at that piano or keyboard and I would play all those old songs, both the religious ones and the secular ones, and he would sing every word. He knew every word of these old songs, and he would sing them. And he loved Amazing Grace. He loved Amazing Grace. So I would sing that to him often. I would sing it often. He especially loved that last verse that says, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Now, John Newton didn't write that verse. That verse came forth actually in the United States when they were having revivals way back when. Somebody wrote it and added it and began singing at revivals. Harriet Beecher Stowe included that verse in her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. But she didn't make it up. She was just repeating the verse heard at all these revivals. So, the day I became your minister, the day I was installed and ordained as your minister in 2006, my dad was across the street over on Grady Street in the hospice, dying, actively dying at the time. It was in a very unusual week. So I would get through with the ordination, which was grand, and I appreciate you all doing that. Then you had a reception for me at the Averett Center, went over there and enjoyed that reception. Then I went to see my daddy, went to see my dying daddy in the hospice. My brother was there at the time too. My daddy says, I got to go. And my brother went over there and says, we know it, Daddy, and it's okay. You can go. And he said, Jane, why don't you come over here and sing Amazing Grace to Dad one more time? And I went over there, and I held my dad's hand, and I sang Amazing Grace. And his mouth, even though he could hardly speak, was moved with every word. And we had the amazing grace to connect together with that song one more time in love and amazing grace. And I'll always be grateful for that. Now, as I said, my dad loved that last verse because he believed he was headed there. So I'm going to ask you now, in honor of my dad and other people that lift up and love this verse, Robert will give us a brief introduction, and we're going to sing it. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. You know, when I think of grace, I think of it kind of in both ways. Doing something gracefully as a gift, as thanks, as favor. But I also do think of grace as what we're given that maybe we don't even deserve. We see a beautiful day. We did nothing to deserve this beautiful day, but we've got it. And if we can be open to grace, we can realize that and take it all in. Now, I take yoga from Inga Spencer. She tells us we have to open up our bodies. And I'd ask you, like, raise your hand and stretch your spine right now and open it up. You all can do it. Raise, open it up. Okay. She says when we open up our bodies, because we're all connected, it helps us to open our minds. It helps us to open our spirits. And that's what we are. Not just in the good times, on the good days, but in the bad times too. We can be open to grace. We can be open to the lessons we learn during these many difficult times. So I encourage you today to be open to that amazing grace. When your heart is in a holy place, when your heart is in a holy place, we are open to love and to amazing grace. And when I rise, let me rise up, like a bird, without regret, gracefully. And when I fall, let me fall down, without regret, gracefully, peacefully, joyfully. Oh, may it be so.